You feel everything, every shift in the room, every unspoken thought, every wound that never quite healed, even when it isn't yours. And while others keep going, you feel the weight of every moment. You're what they call a highly sensitive person, but they don't tell you what that really means. They don't tell you what it costs to carry this much, to notice this much, to feel the world so deeply it scrapes the inside of your skin. They don't tell you that this depth comes with a price, and that sometimes the world makes you pay for it. Carl Jung knew this. He wrote of those who feel more, who perceive the world with a kind of soul sight, not because they choose to, but because they can't not. This is the story of what it means to feel life too deeply, and what it takes to survive it. And the world calls it sensitivity, but what they mean is you bruise faster, you bend quicker, you break quieter. They'll call you too sensitive, too dramatic, too emotional, but they'll never ask what it's like to feel everything at full volume while pretending it's silent. You weren't built for numbness. You were built for resonance, but no one taught you how to live in a world that keeps punishing you for caring too deeply. So you carry it, the overstimulation, the exhaustion, the ache that never really goes away. This is the price of seeing clearly, of hearing beneath the words, of feeling what others refuse to name. But what if this price wasn't a curse? What if it was a call to remember that what breaks you is also where your soul begins to speak? So you try to adjust. You learn how to smile when you're flooded. You learn how to laugh when your nervous system is screaming. You train yourself to sit in overstimulated silence while the world congratulates you for being so easygoing. But deep down, you're not calm, you're managing. And management is its own kind of suffering. They don't see the cost of filtering everything, of carrying invisible weight in every interaction, of having to convince even yourself that what you feel is real enough to matter. Because when you're sensitive, the burden isn't just emotional, it's existential. You're not just feeling more, you're processing more, everything. The light that's too bright, the hum of a refrigerator no one else hears, the off note in someone's voice when they say, "I'm fine." You notice, always. And that noticing becomes a quiet kind of responsibility, like you owe the world your alertness, your empathy, your constant attunement. This is the tax placed on the deeply feeling, the toll of being attuned in a world built for the distracted. Carl Jung wrote that the most terrifying thing is not the world itself, but accepting ourselves completely. Because if you really let yourself see what you feel and feel what you see, you can't unknow it. You become accountable to that truth. And the world doesn't want you to be accountable to your truth. It wants you adjustable, quiet, tolerant of its volume. But you weren't made to live at that volume. You were made to live in resonance. That's why your body recoils when others keep pushing. That's why your soul collapses after small interactions that others shrug off. Not because you're weak, but because you're already carrying too much. They never told you that being this sensitive would cost you stability, belonging, maybe even your identity, but it's true. To feel this deeply is to lose parts of yourself to every moment you enter, unless you learn how to return. And that return to your breath, to your body, to yourself isn't optional anymore. It's sacred. You don't need to feel less. You need to stop apologizing for feeling this much, because sensitivity isn't the problem. It's the language of your soul. And for too long, you've been punished for speaking it. But the price you've paid isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of remembering who you are before the world convinced you to be less. You didn't choose to carry more than others. You just noticed early on that you were. Not louder, not bigger, just deeper. The mood in the room before anyone speaks, the tension in a voice even when the words are kind, the flicker of sadness behind a smile. You didn't understand it, but you felt it. And when you reacted, people told you to calm down, to toughen up, to stop being so sensitive. So you did something unthinkable. You agreed. You learned to laugh when it hurt. You learned to numb the ache before anyone else could notice it. You learned to carry everyone else's emotion while leaving your own behind. This is not strength. This is survival at the expense of the soul. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the parts of ourselves we exile in order to be accepted. For the highly sensitive person, that shadow becomes a graveyard for all the emotions the world told you were too much. But what you bury doesn't die, it grows roots, it shapes you, it waits quietly until your nervous system collapses under the weight of pretending. And then it screams, in the form of chronic exhaustion, in the sudden panic in safe places, in the silent shame of wondering why small things hurt so deeply. You're not malfunctioning, you're split between who you really are and who the world made you pretend to be. There's an old Taoist parable of the reed and the oak. When the storm comes, the oak stands stiff, unyielding, proud, but it breaks. The reed, it bends and lives. You weren't born to be the oak, you were born to bend, to feel, to survive the storm without becoming it. But the world doesn't honor the reed. It honors those who pretend not to feel. And so in trying to be strong, you became invisible. You started performing calmness, performing competence, performing I'm fine, but fine isn't whole, and calmness isn't peace. There comes a moment, quiet, small, when the body refuses to lie anymore, when the soul says, I'm still here, and I'm not going back into the dark. This is that moment, right now. You've been living with a wound so subtle, even you stopped believing it existed, but it's real, and it's not shameful, it's sacred. Because that invisible wound, that ache you carry so privately, is not a sign you're broken. It's a sign you've survived in a world that never learned how to feel. And now you get to do something the world never taught you. You get to feel on purpose, without apology, and without disappearing. You learned early that the full weight of your feelings made people uncomfortable, so you adapted, not by changing who you were, but by hiding what you felt. You didn't become less sensitive, you just got better at pretending. You mastered the art of subtle withdrawal, holding your breath when others spoke too loud, laughing at jokes that made your chest tighten, lowering your eyes in rooms that couldn't hold the size of your truth. But that's not resilience. That's emotional exile, and it doesn't happen in one moment. It happens slowly in the subtle betrayals of your own knowing. Each time you held back a tear, each time you swallowed a boundary, each time you watched someone else take up space while you folded yourself smaller to make them more comfortable. The world rewards that. It calls you agreeable, adaptable, low maintenance. But the soul knows better. It knows that survival at the cost of self-expression is still a kind of death. Carl Jung taught that what we repress returns, just in distorted form. He called it the shadow. And for the sensitive person, that shadow isn't filled with malice, it's filled with unexpressed tenderness, compassion denied, grief that wasn't given a voice. It's not the darkness that haunts you. It's the light you were told was too bright. You traded your sealskin for belonging. There's a story, old and almost forgotten, about the Selkie, a sea creature who came to land and shed her skin. A man stole it. She married him, bore his children, but she was never whole, not without her true form. And one day when she found it again, she returned to the sea, not to abandon her life, but to remember herself. You are the Selkie. You've walked among people who only knew you in fragments, and now your skin is calling you home. Not to escape, not to isolate, but to reunite with the part of you that never stopped feeling, even when you begged it to. The anxiety you call irrational is your sensitivity knocking, the burnout you can't shake. It's the price of living against your nature. You don't need to toughen up. You need to turn inward, not to hide, but to retrieve, to reclaim the depth that makes you different. Because your empathy is not a liability, it's a compass. And the world doesn't need less of that, it needs more. But first, you have to stop hiding it from yourself. What if your pain wasn't just something to heal, but something to honor? Not everything that hurts you is here to destroy you. Some wounds are portals. They open what nothing else can touch. Carl Jung knew this. He believed that the soul expands through suffering, not in spite of it, but because of it. That's why he wrote of individuation, the slow, often painful process of becoming who you already are underneath all the noise, all the masks, all the survival. Highly sensitive people feel like they're collapsing under the weight of emotion, but often what they're collapsing under is containment, years of bottling what was never meant to be buried. There's another myth, just as old and just as true. Chiron, the wounded centaur. He took an arrow that could never be removed, a wound that never closed, but instead of becoming bitter, he became a healer, a teacher, a guide to heroes. His pain didn't make him smaller, it made him sacred. You too are carrying a wound, and maybe it won't ever fully leave. But it can become the place where others find shelter, where your art is born, where your softness turns into strength, because there's a paradox no one told you. The more deeply you feel, the more pain you encounter. Yes, but also the more beauty you can hold. The more nuance you can catch, the more human you become. Sensitivity is intensity in disguise, and it doesn't just amplify suffering, it amplifies truth. That's why HSPs are often artists, therapists, poets, caregivers, people who stand quietly at the edge of chaos and feel what no one else is willing to admit. You're not a misfit, you're a mirror. You reflect what others are too hurried to see, and sometimes that will hurt. Sometimes you'll want to shut it down. Sometimes you'll wish you could be the kind of person who just moves on. But you weren't made to move on. You were made to move through. And what you carry, if you stop resisting it, can become the very thing that sets others free. Not by fixing them, not by healing them, but simply by showing up as someone who didn't bury their depth, someone who stayed soft and survived. You've spent so long trying to make your sensitivity manageable, trying to regulate it, flatten it, make it easier to carry, easier to explain, easier to survive. But maybe the goal was never to reduce your sensitivity. Maybe it was to remember that sensitivity is not weakness, it's depth. You were never meant to be a shallow container. You were meant to hold oceans. Carl Jung believed that the soul does not grow through suppression, but through integration, not by silencing parts of yourself, but by bringing them into relationship. Your sorrow and your joy, your intuition and your logic, your tenderness and your boundaries. And the place where those opposites meet, where grief and grace coexist, is where you become whole. You call it oversensitivity, but what if it's perceptiveness? You call it anxiety. But what if it's a signal telling you something isn't right? You call it exhaustion. But what if it's your nervous system finally saying, I can't hold the lie anymore. There is no healing without confrontation. And the first thing you have to confront is the voice in your head that sounds like society, the one that says, stop taking things so personally, get over it. Everyone's dealing with something. You're making it harder than it needs to be. That voice was never yours. It was trained into you, and it lives on every time you dismiss your own depth as dysfunction. But sensitivity is not a malfunction. It's a frequency, a way of reading the world that picks up what others miss. You feel more because you sense more. You sense more because you were meant to respond to more. You're not just a thinker. You're a translator. You translate tension into awareness, emotion into insight, pain into presence. There's a paradox that lives at the core of every highly sensitive soul. The same world that wounds you is also the world you're here to heal. Not by fixing it, but by refusing to abandon what you feel in the face of its noise. The Moth and the Flame is a story that's often told as a warning. The moth, drawn to the light, burns itself in the fire. But what if that's not tragedy? What if it's devotion? What if the very act of being drawn toward beauty, even when it risks you, is what makes you whole? To feel fully, to love fully, to let beauty move through you, even when it tears you apart. That is not failure. That is aliveness. Your nervous system is not broken, it's attuned. It's not here to harden you, it's here to awaken you. And what if, after all these years, that was the point? Not to become immune to life, but to feel it so deeply that your very presence softens the room. So stop asking, how do I feel less? Start asking, what would happen if I stopped apologizing for feeling so much? Because the light that lives in your wound, it was never meant to be extinguished. It was meant to shine in places no one else dares to look. There comes a moment, not loud, not cinematic, when you simply stop running, not because the noise has quieted, but because you finally remembered what it sounds like to listen to yourself again. You were not meant to live in reaction. You were meant to move from resonance. Carl Jung said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But what he didn't say is how much of that lifetime you'd spend being someone you never were. And now, here you are, not starting over, but starting inward. This is not self-help, this is self-recovery, not becoming better, but becoming known to yourself. You were never meant to perform joy, you were meant to feel it in your bones. You were never meant to carry guilt for needing rest. You were meant to teach the world that slowing down is a form of wisdom. You were never meant to filter your light so others wouldn't squint. You were meant to be the reminder that feeling is sacred. So let yourself cry when the music moves you. Let yourself walk away when the energy doesn't feel right. Let yourself protect your softness like a flame in a windstorm. Because if you don't, no one else will. You're not here to impress. You're here to express the soul of someone who remained sensitive in a world that tried to kill the feeling out of you. And now you know this wasn't a curse, it was a gift. The invisible wound was never emptiness, it was a door, and you walked through it. The world may never reward you for being this open, this responsive, this awake. But the right people will feel you, and they will stay, and those who cannot, let them go. Gently, quietly, without apology, because you're no longer shrinking to be palatable. You're expanding to be whole. And if this video felt like coming home, say so. Leave a sign in the comments, a word, a flame, a whisper that says, I'm here too, and if someone has ever made you feel like you were too much, send this to the person who made you feel like you were just enough. Because this isn't just a story, it's a reclamation. And every sensitive soul deserves to be found, starting with you.